Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Rob. It's my pleasure to talk to you, along with my colleague Tanjim Hossain, about scaling and translating applied behavioral science. My name is Dilip Soman, and I serve as the director of a research center called BEAR here at the Rotman School. The field of applied behavioral science is about 15 years old today. It was born in 2008 with the publication of a book called Nudge by Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein. It's been quite a journey in the past 15 years. It's estimated today that there are upward of 800 different units applying behavioral science in organizations worldwide. And several governments, including our own in Canada, use behavioral science in the design and delivery of policy and programs. If you look back at the first 15 years of this journey, we would argue that the field was characterized by cheerleading. Academics and practitioners alike were busy trying to promote the new science and trying to make a case for why it should be used in organizations worldwide. And the emphasis was more about demonstrating success than about trying to understanding the nuances of when and where behavioral science interventions might work and when they might not. However, 15 years into the journey, it is now perhaps time for the field to stop, take stock, reflect, and think about the major challenges that will confront itself over the years to come. We're going to talk about two. The first is the challenge of adoption. While we can take solace and happiness from the fact that there are 800 plus units, when you compare that to the fact that there are 333 million organizations in the world, it is still a proverbial drop in the bucket. We need to think long and hard as a field as to what the barriers are for adoption. The second challenge, and that's going to be the focus of our talk today, is the challenge relating to translating and scaling our knowledge from the laboratory or from controlled pilots to larger in-field applications. I'm going to provide three examples of situations where scaling and translation did not go as planned. In one demonstration, we know that users of credit cards tend to spend more holding everything else constant as compared to users of cash or checks. In one pilot demonstration, I and then many others have shown that simply providing people with feedback on how much they have spent in the past through reminders, through numerical prompts, or through text messages will reduce the so-called credit card premium. In a large-scale equivalent of this principle, the government in South Korea back in 2010 mandated that all credit card providers, companies, start texting people with updates on how much they had actually spent. Our research in looking through the data shows that, in fact, providing this data ended up increasing spending, not decreasing spending on the population on average. Of course, when we look carefully, there were two subgroups. For about 12% of the population, the heavy spenders, we did see exactly what we got in the original pilots, in the original experiments. But for about 88%, we found the opposite effect. The lighter spenders, rather than being motivated to keep track of expenses, they were now demotivated because they knew that their phones would keep the data if they really needed it. So they disengaged. Second example, in work we were doing in Mexico in an effort to try and increase contribution to pensions, we took the quarterly pension statement and tried to make it engaging and appealing and simple. This has been shown in previous demonstrations to increase comprehension as well as to increase the outcomes, in this case, getting people to contribute more to their pensions. However, our research showed that making the document simple and engaging did actually improve the outcome for only about half the population. For the other half, it reduced contributions significantly and it backfired. Now, why was this going on? This happened, we think, because making the document more engaging got people to focus on the performance of the pension fund. Obviously, about half the people were better than average and the other half were worse. For people whose pension funds were performing well, better than average, they were motivated to contribute more. And we saw the results that previous research had in fact found. But for the other half, when the pension fund wasn't doing well, results actually showed the opposite effect because people now paid more attention to the fund's performance and they essentially ended up moving their money elsewhere. In a third example, research has shown that simply reminding people through text messaging about behaviors that they need to undertake, in this case, making a contribution, increase the likelihood that they would do so. In Mexico, we found that a text message reminding people to think about their family's financial future worked, but only for a subset of the population. Using techniques from machine learning, we were able to determine what kind of messages worked for which subset of the population. And we were then able to figure out what's the best message to send whom. We learned an important lesson. We learned throughout these three examples that the correct way of scaling was not simply to do the same thing for everyone, but to identify these patterns of differences, or what we call heterogeneity, and then customize interventions for these different subgroups. 12% versus 88%, high performing, low performing, people with families, people without, all deserve different kinds of behavioral interventions. Put differently, we're simply saying that successfully scaled interventions need not be homogeneous. They could actually be customized and heterogeneous. Tanjim will speak more as to why we have heterogeneity and what we can do about it.
Thanks, Dilip. These three examples are suggestive of the kinds of translation and scaling challenges we see in the field. I'll now illustrate how some of these challenges might play a role if an intervention from the academic literature were to be scaled up and applied in other organizations. In a paper I co-authored with John List, we explored the insight from Kahneman and Tversky that framing an outcome as a loss instead of a gain may impact people's behavior differently in the work setting in a high-tech manufacturing facility, which was in China. We showed that productivity increase in workers in response to a bonus for higher performance depended on how this bonus was framed. Specifically, both the gain and loss framing of incentives, or the bonus, increased productivity compared to the baseline group who received the bonus. So monetary incentives clearly worked. Great. However, provisionally committing to the bonus and taking it away as a punishment in case of not reaching high performance, either loss frame, that is the loss framing, had a small but significant increase in productivity over presenting the same bonus as a reward for high performance, which was the gain framing. Even though this productivity increase through framing is small in magnitude, this happened in a real work setting with real workers, and the increase came for free, making this a great candidate for a scalable intervention. If this small gain in productivity can be scaled up to large populations of workers, this would indeed make a significant impact to welfare. However, the question remains regarding whether this can be scaled up. First, we'll examine the contextual features of the study. Each intervention was implemented for only about a month, which is actually relatively large for academic studies, but in real life may not be super long. While the impact was evident over the duration of the experiment, framing incentives as a loss may not be successful if this change were to be permanent or much longer in duration. For example, continuously framing an incentive as a loss may make workers less sensitive to framing. It might even have negative emotional consequences on a workforce in the long run. The effectiveness of loss framing may also depend on the size of the economic incentives. In our study, the size of the bonus was above 20% of any of the workers' base salary. The treatment effect for smaller size incentives may be insignificant. Second, heterogeneity within the workforce may also lead to unintended consequences if the loss framing intervention was to be scaled up. It is noteworthy that we did not find any significant framing effect for individual workers, but rather the effect of loss framing was only significant for teams of workers. This suggests that loss framing might not be as effective for independent workers. This may also depend on societal and cultural norms. This study was run in a more collective kind of society. Results may be different in more individualistic kind of society. Third, we need to be aware the impact of loss aversion on productivity depends on the interaction of the framing and the underlying incentive scheme. This suggests that incentives have to be deployed along the dimension of productivity the policymaker is interested in. If the policymaker is interested in increasing net productivity or in absolute terms, then framing in terms of total productivity makes sense. If the policymaker is interested in relative productivity, which we would be interested in tournaments and so on, like sports sim might be interested in, then the framing may need to be on in terms of winning versus losing. Hence, one needs to be careful in choosing the economic part of the intervention while scaling up to ensure that it does not backfire. A final issue is that in practice, businesses and policymakers are often tempted to throw multiple things that work elsewhere in a throw everything into the kitchen sink approach. As the interaction of different interventions may create unexpected consequences, this is more likely to be counterproductive. These potential issues do not suggest that this type of incentive schemes is not a candidate for a scaled-up intervention. Rather, this should highlight some of the potential considerations that should be taken into account before scaling is done to ensure that the intervention is a good candidate for the context and the population that will be targeted by the intervention. We'd like to conclude by suggesting that the best way to overcome these challenges is to test before scaling interventions. And in particular, we suggest in situ testing. After carefully considering how the context and sample used to test an intervention may differ from other contexts, next is to test the intervention. In situ testing here refers to testing and creating an intervention that is bespoke to the context in which it will be employed, utilizing as diverse population as possible within this context, as there is quite a bit of heterogeneity, as we have illustrated in population. We strongly suggest that this is done to ensure that precious resources are not needlessly spent on scaled-up interventions that may not work or even backfire. While it will be disappointing if an intervention does not have the intended consequences during in situ testing, it could be catastrophic if interventions are scaled up without any due diligence. We'll now pass it on to Alex Osterwalder.